You know that old saying, right? Absolute power corrupts absolutely. It's a classic for a reason. But in this explainer, we're going to challenge that idea just a little bit. Because when you really flip through the pages of history, you start to see that sometimes absolute power doesn't just corrupt, sometimes it just makes things go completely unbelievably off the rails. So, welcome to our explainer on absolute chaos. Let's get right into it.
So what actually happens when the person with all the power completely loses their mind? That's the core question we're tackling today. And to be clear, we are not just talking about kings with some weird hobbies or quirky tastes. No, we're looking at emperors who were so entirely out of touch with reality that their own advisors, their families, and their whole empires had to invent these absolutely absurd workarounds just to survive the day. Like, when a leader genuinely loses the plot but still holds the absolute power of life and death over millions, what does the Tuesday morning administrative meeting of a country even look like?
Okay, let's dive into this. We've got a chronological roadmap here of 5 distinct historical case studies. Justin II, Charles VI, Zhengde, Ibrahim I, and lastly, Christian VII.
First up, Justin II, the cannibal emperor.
Okay, picture this. It's 565 AD, and Justin inherits the Eastern Roman Empire, but the crushing stress of invading armies and an empty treasury basically broke his mind. His behavior got incredibly erratic and honestly really violent. He started hearing voices. He'd scream at absolutely nothing. And, according to a historian who was actually there at court, the palace guards were literally terrified of him because he would try to eat his own servants. He wasn't just, nipping them. He had to be physically restrained. So to manage the literal ruler of the Roman Empire, his palace staff basically had to treat him like a giant, dangerous toddler. They strapped him to a small cart and just wheeled him around the palace to keep him contained. And what's even wilder? They found out that organ music calmed him down, so they just played it constantly. If they didn't have music, his attendants would literally roll him past windows while running alongside, making funny faces outside, just to distract them from eating people.
But, despite the pure absurdity of the organ music and the little cart, there's a profound sadness to this whole thing. Eventually, Empress Sophia managed to convince him to appoint a general named Tiberius as co-emperor to actually run things. And in one of his incredibly rare moments of lucidity, Justin supposedly gave Tiberius this completely heartbreaking quote, "May God be with you. I myself am nothing now." He spent the last 5 years of his life as a restrained, biting, screaming man, just being wheeled around his own palace.
All right, moving on to number 2, Charles VI, the Glass King.
Now, what's really interesting about this next one is how specific the delusion was. Fast forward to 1392, France. A dropped lance clangs loudly against a helmet, and 23-year-old Charles just snaps. He attacks his own men, and from there, he develops this compounding, incredibly intense delusion. He became absolutely convinced that his body was made of glass. He thought that if anyone even bumped into him, he would literally shatter into pieces. He actually made his tailors sew heavy iron rods into his clothing just to keep his glass body from breaking. He'd stand perfectly still for hours on end out of pure terror. And the absolute worst part? Over the course of 30 years, he completely forgot who he was. He didn't recognize his wife, his kids, not even his own royal coat of arms. He would just wander the halls screaming that he wasn't the king.
Now, the impact of this was catastrophic. While the king was busy wandering the halls, terrified of breaking, his relatives, specifically his brother and his cousin, decided to wage a massive, bloody civil war for control of France. It was this exact internal chaos, this massive royal power vacuum, that allowed England's King Henry V to sweep in and win the famous Battle of Agincourt in 1415. So think about that. The 100 Years' War might have played out completely differently if the King of France hadn't firmly believed he was a fragile glass vase.
Number 3. Emperor Zhengde, the pretend shopkeeper.
Okay, jumping over to 1505 China. We have 13-year-old Emperor Zhengde who inherits unchecked power over the largest empire on Earth. But he decides actually ruling is kind of boring. So he invents this bizarre alter ego for himself, a fake military rank named General Zhu Sha. He would literally sit down, draft official documents from this fake general requesting permission to do things, and submit them to himself, the emperor. Then he'd swap hats, act as the emperor, and approve his own requests. And his actual real-life ministers were forced to process all these fake documents through the genuine imperial bureaucracy. You literally had the administrative machine of a massive empire getting totally clogged up by one guy's elaborate game of pretend.
And the roleplay didn't even stop there.
He had an enormous fake city built inside the palace grounds called the Leopard Quarter. It was fully decked out with fake shops and restaurants. The emperor would dress up as a commoner and haggle over prices with his eunuchs, who had to play along and pretend to be merchants, even using fake money. In 1517, he finally got to act out his military fantasy in a minor skirmish against Mongol raiders, which of course he wildly exaggerated into some epic victory. But the pretend games came to a screeching halt when he decided to literally wrestle a live tiger in his private zoo. He badly injured himself and probably took about 10 years off his officials' lives from the sheer stress.
Okay, on to number 4, Ibrahim I, the caged sultan.
So, to really understand Ibrahim, you have to understand how Ottoman succession worked back then. Instead of executing rival princes, they locked them in a gilded prison called the Kafis. Ibrahim's own mother, Kosum Sultan, once had to show him his brother's dead body just to coax him out to rule, because before that, he spent 22 years locked inside that room. 22 years of total isolation, living in daily terror that today might be his last. It absolutely destroyed his mental health. So the moment he was finally let out and handed absolute power, the cracks showed immediately.
Within a matter of months, Ibrahim developed these totally bizarre obsessions. He became hyper-fixated on fur. He draped the walls, the floors, the ceilings of his palace in it, and forced his concubines to wear absolutely nothing but fur. When his advisors tentatively mentioned that the treasury was running low, his genius solution was to demand more gold from the provinces, just so he could physically throw the coins into fish ponds and watch them sink. Oh, and perhaps the strangest detail of all, he allegedly became obsessed with the shape of a cow. He had his agents scour the entire empire to find a woman with matching proportions. And they actually found one, an enormous Armenian woman who became an absolute favorite at court.
So the crucial point here is this wasn't just some harmless eccentricity. It turned incredibly dark, incredibly fast. A single rumor started going around that one of his concubines had been unfaithful. And Ibrahim's response? Horrific. He had 280 women bound in weighted sacks and thrown into the Bosphorus Strait to drown. 280 lives completely snuffed out over one rumor. Obviously, this was the absolute breaking point. By 1648, his own mother authorized a coup against him. Ibrahim was thrown right back into the exact same cage he'd spent 22 years in right before being executed.
Finally, number 5, Christian VII, the Slapping King. Let's head over to 1766 Denmark. 17-year-old Christian VII takes the throne. Now, at first, he seemed great, intelligent, charming, a highly anticipated ruler. But within just 6 months, he turned into an absolute public menace. He'd walk right up and violently slap dignitaries and servants across the face mid-conversation, totally unprovoked. He completely ignored and publicly insulted his 15-year-old wife, Queen Caroline Matilda. He'd go on these wild nightly rampages through Copenhagen, just smashing windows. He banged his head against walls until he bled and mutilated his own hands until they were permanently scarred. His main delusion was that invisible forces were controlling him, which led him to stare into mirrors for hours on end, hunting for his real self. Other times he'd just completely shut down into a severe catatonic state, sitting motionless for days.
Let's move to the timeline and see how this builds, because the real shocker is what happened next. A German physician named Johann Friedrich Strunzi was brought in to treat the king. Well, Strunzi takes one look, realizes Christian is completely checked out mentally, and does something absolutely audacious. He befriends the king, wins his trust, and basically takes over the entire country. For 16 months, this doctor issued over 1,000 royal decrees in Christian's name, while simultaneously having a full-blown affair and fathering a child with the queen. Eventually, the Danish nobility caught on, staged a coup, and had Strunzi brutally executed. As for Christian, he stayed on as a mere figurehead for another 36 years, doing absolutely nothing, except occasionally slapping people, while regents ran the actual country.
And this brilliantly illustrates something fascinating. When we look at this summary, a super clear pattern emerges. The story of royal madness, it's not actually just about the madmen themselves. It is fundamentally about the desperate, terrified coping mechanisms of the normal people trapped underneath them. Whether it was playing the organ to soothe the cannibal, processing a fake general's paperwork, or a random doctor secretly running a whole country, the systems literally had to bend and contort to accommodate the broken minds at the very top. We've just looked at 5 absolute rulers who brought their empires right to the brink, not through malice or some evil grand plan, but through the complete and total collapse of their sanity. So what does it all mean? I want to leave you with this to ponder. What does it truly say about hereditary, absolute power when the fate of millions of people completely hinges on the fragile, fallible mental health of a single human being? The next time someone tells you they wish they lived back in the days of absolute kings and queens, you might just want to remind them of the Glass King and the pretend shopkeeper. Thanks for joining me on this